Thank you. Thank you. Today we have some discussions about the exposing the truth behind political coup d'etat in Ambazonia, where we have Dr. Atanga and Henry Atam, who will be giving a good and succinct preview of the happening in Ambazonia. Okay, and we'll see the also with the discussions is with Professor Paul, who also is a professor of political science. Dr. Paul William is a we want to thank him for his sacrifice to let our voices be heard in Ambazonia. Okay, and they'll be talking about Paul Biya and his long serving, and how his leadership has been controversial and dictatorial, his authoritarian rule on the people of Ambazonia, and much more will be discussed. Okay, thank you for listening. God bless you. God bless the people of Ambazonia. This public notice is to inform all Ambazonians on ground zero that the so-called lockdown that was recently announced by a certain Willie has been declared null and void by the group of leaders, the Ambazonian leaders. They want something that is unanimous. Once you want to declare lockdown now, they want that all the leaders should have the same voice, because we're trying to look for a united voice, not any individual come out with their own lockdown and declared lockdowns. Okay, so this guy called Willie is we know is just a lone and unstable individual who just take for himself and do things, sending out some funny messages around, and okay, he doesn't have any portfolio to declare lockdown. You have to do consultation with other leaders. With this liberation movement has gone too far to still continue this old way of doing things. Okay, so Ambazonians, you are therefore encouraged to disregard the so-called lockdown and any other messages coming from this individual. So please stay away from this kind of okay. What lockdown we want to see in Ambazonia today is a lockdown where all Ambazonians will come together, the leaders will come together and declare with the restoration forces. They will declare a lockdown. That is what we want to see. We don't want individuals going around declaring lockdowns on the people of Ambazonia. Okay, thank you for listening, and God bless Ambazonia.
In the dawn of our struggle, we rise and we stand through the valleys of shadows, hand in hand. From the whispers of pain to the shouts of our song, in the spirit of freedom,
process
together we belong.
Encroaching, eroding
Freedom
the
is not
English
free,
cultures
but
and
we're close to
implanting
the
the French
land.
culture.
With our dreams
And I
and
think 2016 was a peak of this encroachment, where they then said, no, this is too much. We need to resist, otherwise we will be completely assimilated.
The 2016 strike just adds to a series of strikes against the erosion of the Southern Cameroon's identity. And the evolution of social media really exposed the brutality of government forces against the striking teachers and lawyers. And that is where the issue really exacerbated, and it turned to a full-fledged conflict.
It started with machetes, not even guns, before it grew to where we are today. So I'm looking at this crucial moment where government failed to negotiate, and government has repeatedly failed to negotiate with several opportunities that has been given to the government, not listening to the voice of the people.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. In each episode, we engage with diplomats, lawyers, and peace builders who have played pivotal roles in efforts to resolve conflicts around the world. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am joined by two remarkable guests, Dr. Lillian Atanga and Henry Atam, both of whom have played pivotal roles in efforts to drive forward peace between Ambazonia and Cameroon. Dr. Lillian Atanga is an influential voice in the intersection of gender, discourse, and politics, serving previously as an associate professor in the University of Bumenda and currently a senior researcher at the University of the Free State, Bloemfontein, South Africa. Lillian was also a key figure in the Southwest Northwest Women's Task Force, a powerful coalition of women-led civil society organizations dedicated to championing peace and rebuilding social harmony in southern Cameroon. Beyond her academic experience, Dr. Atanga was the executive director of I Am Cameroon, an inspiring NGO that empowers young people to be agents of change and leadership in their communities. Henry Atam is a political and electoral affairs consultant with the United Nations and the executive director of the United States Center for Electoral Support, bringing over a decade of experience in election administration and conflict prevention to help parties effectively conduct free and fair elections. Henry's extensive experience includes managing election assistance programs in developing democracies and participation in more than 15 electoral observation missions, making him a seasoned advocate for the democratic process. In late 2022, my colleague Ryan Westlake and I had the privilege of working alongside Henry, Lillian, and the team at the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations to help the Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia delegation prepare for peace negotiations with the government of Cameroon after years of conflict. Today, we'll reflect on that process and the lessons learned. Lillian, Henry, thank you both for joining me. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, let's go ahead. And before we dive into the specifics of the peace talks, could you provide us some background on the Southern Cameroon conflict? What are the key underlying causes that have fueled this conflict over the decades?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Before I jump into the question, many have called the conflict an Anglophone conflict, right? But when you use the word Anglophone, one is tempted to think that it's a conflict or crisis emanating from a language issue. And so in reality, it's deeper and more profound than that. So I would use the term Southern Cameroons, Ambazonia. In some cases, I can go on with Anglophone, but just to make sure that your listeners understand that one can use Southern Cameroon's conflict, Ambazonian conflict, and others can also as well use Anglophone conflict to describe the nature of the conflict. The underlying cause of the conflict is the attempt to assimilation of the people of the Southern Cameroons. I will use the words of the President Biya himself while he was in Paris, into an identity different from theirs. You can talk about the systems, you can talk about the processes and the way of life, from education to judiciary to governance to freedoms and rights. So those are all attempts at peaceful dialogue with the government of Cameroon were made by reputable Southern Cameroonians without any response of the government. So carrying arms was seen by some as the best alternatives after the brutal response by the government forces during a peaceful protest led by teachers and lawyers in 2016. Lillian may add a little bit of flesh into that.
Well, at a deeper level and at a more visible level to the ordinary people, these discriminations manifested themselves in educational systems where the English-speaking Cameroonians, who are Southern Cameroonians, differently from Anglophone Cameroonians, found that their system of education, which is British-based, following the colonial rule, is completely different from the Francophone system of education, which is French-based. And the imposition of the French educational system, not just in terms of curriculum, but the language in use in educational systems was a problem. And a lot more French-speaking Cameroonians were teaching in the English-speaking Cameroons in language which was approximative English and sometimes French to children who were supposed to be speaking English and learning in English. That became a big problem. And from a personal perspective, I moderated pre-2016 on a lot of teachers' meetings complaining that their children are being taught by French-speaking or Francophones in a language that wasn't English. At a legal perspective, that was also very visible in the different legal systems where the Anglophones were using the common law and the Francophones were using, I don't know what law that is. But then the encroachment of the different legal systems was a problem. But then this did not happen only recently in 2016. These problems were problems that had been planted at the beginning of the Republic, a republic which was initially the British Southern Cameroons with a system that was brought in from when they were still in Nigeria and being administered by Britain into the French Cameroons to a French system that was an adoption of the French, as in France, system of education and legal system. And these two parallel systems had coexisted, sometimes each independent from the other. But as Henry said, the assimilation process meant encroaching, eroding the English cultures of the English system and implanting the French culture. And I think 2016 was a peak of this encroachment where they then said, no, this is too much. We need to resist, otherwise we will be completely assimilated. One thing that we have to note is that these Anglophones kept noticing the gradual encroachment into that system, and they kept complaining. And there was a communique by the teacher syndicate of the University of Boya that if nothing is done, this will escalate into violence or a war that the government may not be able to deal with. And true to it, 2 years down the line from that note from the teachers of the University of Boya to the Minister of Higher Education, it happened just like that. But this is not something that just happened in 2016. It's something that had been brewing for over 40 years to 2016. So we had the remote courses, which date back to colonial time, and the immediate courses, which was a resistance by the government to listen to the voice of the people.
Now, Lillian and Henry, picking up on that, with the 2016 strike by the teachers and the lawyers, because of these issues, the encroachment by the Francophone into the Anglophone system, the response, as you know, it wasn't to listen to the concerns and the demands, but basically to meet these protests with a very heavy-handed government response, government action. Can you walk us through that time period of 2016 and how that government response galvanized the formation of separatist movements advocating for a heightened degree of internal self-determination or external self-determination in the form of an independent Ambazonia or Southern Cameroons?
Let me say this. Separatist propaganda, right, and groups like the Southern Cameroon Youth League already existed before 2016, but were not armed to engage in fighting. So you have leaders like Ebenezer Akwanga, who was the leader of the Southern Cameroon Youth Movement, was arrested and jailed on grounds of inciting secession way years before 2016. He escaped from jail. He succeeded in escaping from jail and got through Nigeria to the US and advocated for the use of arms as a means to compel the government to engage in negotiations. I mean, and that was way far before 2016. So the foundation of an armed struggle was already in place. But let me take you through some historical facts that informed the outbursts in 2016. In 1960, the Republic of Cameroon gained independence and was admitted into the United Nations. 1961, Southern Cameroon was voted to gain independence by joining the Republic of Cameroon. I'm using the word Republic of Cameroon, and you will definitely see where it reappears again. And when that happened, that was on condition that a federal system would ensure self-governance and preserve the identity of the people of the Southern Cameroons. In 1972, the two-state federal system, West, that represented the Anglophone Cameroons, and East Cameroon, that represented the French-speaking part of Cameroon, was abolished through a referendum, in what many say was the beginning of the assimilation process, because many felt it was in violation of the provisions of the federal constitution that permitted the change of the form of state. So most of the big corporations in the Southern Cameroons were closed, from electricity supply to road construction and others, and the name of the country was changed from the Federal Republic of Cameroon to the United Republic of Cameroon. Now, 12 years later, that was 1984, President Biya, through a decree, changed the name from the United Republic of Cameroon back to the Republic of Cameroon. The name the French part of Cameroon had when they gained independence in 1960. And so many thought that that was the erosion, the disappearance of the existence of the Southern Cameroons. And so this was further viewed as erasing Southern Cameroons or West Cameroon. And as a result, a renowned Southern Cameroonian lawyer from Ngodi Dinka argued that the decree invalidates the agreement in 1961 between the two entities. He advocated for the restoration of the independence of the Southern Cameroons and gave the name Ambazonia in 1984. So many only knew the name Ambazonia after 2017, but in real fact, that name existed since 1984. And so that was around 1992, during the third democratic wave. The first multi-party elections were held. And it is believed that the opposition party led by an Anglophone, John Fundi of blessed memory, won the elections, but President Biya was declared as winner. There was also a general belief that based on the results declared, a Southern Cameroonian can never be president because the government would not allow that to happen. That also increased the level of resentment among Southern Cameroonians, that they don't see themselves belonging to that country. Now, in 1993 and 1994, respectively, in Buea and Bamenda, you had notables, the All Anglophone Conference 1 in Buea and the All Anglophone Conference 2 in Bamenda. But key to the resolutions of those conferences was the request for a two-state federation, back to a two-state federation. And they were categorical about advocating for separation if a dialogue about the federal system was not held. So the armed conflict 22 years later, right, was a culmination of several failed attempts to address the issue. the 2016 strike just adds to a series of strikes against the erosion of the Southern Cameroon's identity. And the evolution of social media really exposed the brutality of government forces against the striking teachers and lawyers. And that is where the issue really exacerbated in 2017 when they were arrested, and it turned to a full-fledged conflict because the Southern Cameroon Youth League that was led by Akwanga was converted to the Southern Cameroon Defense Forces. And the Secretary General of the Southern Cameroon Youth League, the now detained Dr. Cho Ayaba, also formed the ADF, the Ambazonian Defense Forces. And from that time, we had the fighting started, heavy fighting started, millions were displaced. There was international attention on the conflict, and many of the members of the lawyers and the teachers consortium escaped to Nigeria. Former Ambazonian political organizations that existed out of the country came together to form the interim government, whose leader, Seseko Ayob Tabe, declared independence later in 2017. And so that's how it evolved until today. We see how the armed conflict still continues.
Thank you, Henry. Lillian, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I think one key thing now that we're talking about peace and negotiations, the many failed attempts at peace and negotiation, and I'll bring just this one at this material moment in time. When the teachers and lawyers went on strike, there was an opportunity for the government of Cameroon to negotiate and have peace. And several meetings were held to have this negotiation. And because the government kept reneging on its previous promises, the final meeting that failed and led to where we are today was held in Benin, in which everything collapsed. At that moment, up to that last meeting, the negotiation involved them reclaiming their identity, and separation was not part of that. Although at some point, federation was evoked, and they requested federation so that they could have full control of their institutions, their systems, and their way of life, including their identity, which they assert it's not Anglophone because Anglophone is relating to a linguistic difference rather than a cultural difference and an ethnic difference between the two people. Had the government given in to the request at the crucial moment, there wouldn't have been an escalation into an armed conflict. But because it failed at that material moment, and on September 22nd, when there was a civil armless protest by the Southern Cameroonians, and the government was heavy-handed on them, bombarding them with helicopters and killing people, that is the material moment that everything starts. And they then decided to defend themselves. It started with machetes, not even guns, before it grew to where we are today. So I'm looking at this crucial moment where government failed to negotiate, and government has repeatedly failed to negotiate with several opportunities that has been given to the government, not listening to the voice of the people.
Lillian and Henry, oftentimes the government now, bearing in mind what you've just said, will say, oh, we had a 2019 national dialogue. And I'm quite keen to get your views on that, because in other places that we work, a national dialogue is oftentimes seen as a panacea to the conflict or a first step in constitutional reform. And President Biya, hosted this national dialogue, claimed that the outcome was some type of special status for in his work, the Anglophone region. This didn't stem the violence. Was this simply a Potemkin effort? Was this somehow glossing over the situation and trying to pretend that momentum was being made through consultation? And what were the consequences of this failed 2019 national dialogue?
Now, there are several factors that pushed the government to announce and eventually host the major national dialogue. One, the conflict was intensifying, with hundreds displaced daily after the arrest in Nigeria of the leader of the Ambazonian interim government. Some will say abduction. And in May 18, remember that the national dialogue was announced in September. But in May 2018, you had an area formula meeting, right, hosted by the United Nations Security Council on humanitarian issues and, putting the government on guard on the consequences of an eventual humanitarian catastrophe. In July 2018, there was a U.S. congressional delegation that visited Cameroon and urged the government to engage in dialogue to end the conflict. And in September, of course, President Biya called for a major national dialogue. I guess there was also a joint AU, Commonwealth, and La Francophonie delegation that was also planned to visit Cameroon in November of that same year, 2018. So it was easy from events to say the government was looking for a safe route to stay away from international scrutiny or pressure, or legitimize authority over the situation and prove to the international community that actions were being taken to address the problem. Whether that was done in good faith or not, the execution of the major national dialogue fell short of its organizational and operational expectations. And of course, the outcome could not have been accepted by the Ambazonian political groups. The consequences of the non-acceptance is that fighting continued and intensified around still late teen. In October, immediately after the national dialogue, there were elections, right? There were elections with a very heavy boycott from the Anglophone Southern Cameroon's regions, delegitimizing the government. The outcome of the elections by not even just participating. There was below 10% participation in those regions. So that's also proof to show that the national dialogue did not produce the kind of results that they expected. The major part of it was that the armed groups, of course, did not accept the outcome of the national dialogue, even though the government continues to implement the resolution of the dialogue.
Go ahead, Lillian, if you'd like to provide some additional context and thoughts on the national dialogue.
If I may add my perspective to the major national dialogue, like you said, a Potemkin effect, both the organization and the operationalization of the dialogue, I think the government was actively aware of how it will run and the outcome. First, the invitations, who was to participate in the dialogue. They invited the Cameroonian diaspora. True, they invited some of the leaders, but with a precedent that the other leaders have been jailed. It was known that the others cannot take the risk of returning to Cameroon for a dialogue, knowing that they also risk being jailed, which therefore means, as a separatist colleague, it was going to be a monologue. The question is, was a dialogue between the government of Cameroon and the citizens of Cameroon, or the government of Cameroon and the southern Cameroonians who are complaining? Who was a dialogue with? It was not well defined, although national dialogues are supposed to be with the whole country. But what was the problem that was being addressed? That wasn't clear. And that was also evident in the agenda of that dialogue. Certain topics were admitted, other topics were not admitted. Everything was controlled by the government. It was a top-down dialogue. It was not a bottom-up dialogue. It was very elitist. And any other people who were not elites were carefully selected and groomed to act. I would say this is my analysis. With such a staged and a crafted dialogue, evidently the outcome was predicted, which means the government knew exactly what they wanted. They were staging to the international community that they are carrying out the dialogue, not an intention to solve an internal problem. And drafted the resolution of the dialogue, I believe, before even the end of the dialogue. And these resolutions have served as a foundation for any other attempt at dialogue and negotiation, and any attempt at moving away from those resolutions is not accepted or tolerated by the government, even if they are not very overt about this, which therefore means that the government has, I believe, again, that they have very specific outcomes they need, which are independent of the desires of the people, which I think would have been what they are looking for. What do the people want, and how can we negotiate with these people for there to be peace? An absence of negotiation with the people, therefore, cannot result in peace if there is no inclusion of the grassroots in any dialogue.
So basically, they held a national monologue, and now they've used the outcome resolutions to framework or constrain what solutions might exist. Between 2020 and 2022, this conversation, to a degree, moved to Geneva with the Swiss government through something called the Geneva Initiative, attempting to mediate the conflict. Now, according to commentators, the progress was slow and fragmented, in part given the variety of views among the separatist groups and those representing the Southern Cameroonians, and deep skepticism from the Cameroonian government. But can you describe a little bit for us the Swiss peace process and share your thoughts as to why it failed?
Yeah, the Swiss government announced in June 2019 their readiness to facilitate dialogue between the warring parties, and appointed, I think, an Ambassador Gunther Bachelet, as principal mediator or facilitator for this dialogue. And there was kind of an acceptance from the grassroots, right? A cross-section of the Ambazonian groups also accepted to be part of that process. A few, of course, including armed groups, did not accept, but they were en route to accepting should the government demonstrate an engagement in the process. And as such, the Swiss also delegated, I think, different organizations to help with capacity building for the Ambazonian group, the political groups in the diaspora, and the armed groups whose leaders were in the diaspora, but also another organization to train grassroots organizations, women organizations, rights organizations, to ensure that everyone is prepared to engage in a meaningful dialogue. That took place over 3 years, still waiting for the government to engage in a very meaningful way. But like Lillian said, the government was more preoccupied with implementing the resolutions of the major national dialogue and lose sight, or intentionally lose sight of doing any engagement with the Swiss. And I think it was in 2022 that they made it official to the Swiss government that they are not involved, they will not be participating in any Swiss process. And that's how the Swiss process died. In a discussion with the Swiss, they indicated that the government, like Lillian said, wanted them to engage in a process within the framework of the major national dialogue. Because after the major national dialogue, there was a major national dialogue implementation commission headed by the Prime Minister. And so every other discussion that had to take place around dialogue, as far as the government is concerned, should take place within that context. And anything out of that context, the government would not agree. And because the Swiss had invested in training, bringing the political and armed groups, including grassroots movements on the ground, on how a real negotiation process looks like, it was very difficult for the Swiss now to go back and say, no, what we have trained you is not what we think would happen. We will need to align with this other resolution. So at that stage, the Swiss could not do it, and they withdrew. And so that's how the Swiss process collapsed. But the Swiss had invested a lot of time, a lot of resources to make sure that the Ambazonian Southern Cameroon or Anglophone delegation was well prepared for eventual dialogue, genuine dialogue with the government.
Lillian, do you have additional thoughts to add on the Geneva process?
I'm seeing a trend. First, pre-2017, when the government had an opportunity to negotiate with teachers and lawyers, they failed. 2019, in the major national dialogue, when they had a real opportunity to negotiate, even if it was not with the separatist fighters, but with the Southern Cameroonians, they failed because they restricted topics, they restricted who to talk with, and they designated who to talk with. They failed. Third opportunity is what we just discussed now. With the Swiss trained grassroots movement, the trained diaspora movement, they got people ready for a dialogue. The government reneged on it, and they failed. And this trend just keeps going. We are waiting to see how it ends.
Lillian, let's stay with you and stay with this trend, because after the Swiss talks failed, the Canadians joined the conversation and held 3 rounds of negotiations, consultations, which also ultimately failed. And in a few moments, we'll talk more details about the substance and the proposal. But how did those Canadian talks fit into this trend, which you've just...
Prior to the Canadian trend, when the international community kept asking questions, the government of Cameroon kept saying, we don't know who to talk with. And that became a real big excuse, because then the Southern Cameroonian organizations, they got, in quotes, fragmented as described by the government. And then they thought there was no one to stick with. And our organization, the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations, was very instrumental in threading through these fragments. I still use fragment in quote. Through different engagements, one-on-one engagement, group engagement, we took them to Canada the first year, 2021, and then the second time, 2022. And they started working together, and they know that they have a unity of purpose. So when we work with these organizations, it then became evident that these organizations can work together to stand as a united front in any event of negotiations. And Canada happened. But then when Canada happened, Henry was a central figure from the organization that worked with the government of Cameroon and the government of Canada. And Henry has deeper insights into this from a first-hand perspective. And I'll allow him to speak to that.
Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Lillian. First, we are told that the Prime Minister, head of government of the Republic of Cameroon, initiated the Canada talks. And it is fair to say Canada and Cameroon have excellent relations. And Canada has invested in peace efforts and provided majority of the funding during the Swiss initiative. So Canada had a vested interest for peace and is one of the major providers of humanitarian assistance for displaced people as a consequence of the conflict. So as we're told, the head of government, the Prime Minister, reached out to Canada to facilitate discussions with Ambazonian groups. Canada accepted and initiated the press meet with Ambazonian leaders in Canada. Remember, this was coming at a time when fighting was ongoing, disruption of service delivery, the absence of government officials in almost all rural communities in southern Cameroon, threats to schools, continuous abuse and death of civilians, which undermined the efforts by the government to bring back normalcy. And that was occurring after 4 years of struggling to implement the resolutions of the National Dialogue. So it was evident that the government needed to do more. And because there was no reduction in the amount of people being displaced, the refugees were still in Nigeria. And so government still had the pressure to do something, especially because they needed to show that after the national dialogue, the government is still engaging with the Ambazonian leadership. So Canada accepted to facilitate the discussions, and that's how the Canada talks started.
In just a moment, let's dive into a conversation about the big picture substantive issues, and then those substantive issues which were dealt with or attempted to be dealt with in the Canadian process, and the sort of bizarre ending of the Canadian process. But before we do that, I want to hear about your personal stories. How did you come to be so deeply involved in efforts to secure peace in Cameroon, to empower grassroots organizations, to empower women, to help build or coalesce a platform among the separatist movements? And Lillian, do you want to jump in first, and then we can turn it to Henry for his story?
I come at a very interesting intersection, and I want to bring a personal story here. I lived in Cameroon until 2019. 2018, the coalition for the Southwest Northwest Women's Task Force was formed. That was the time when killing was at its peak. You see dead bodies on the street on a daily basis, several dead bodies. And that was a time when women had never seen that happening in their lifetime. And the trauma was big and real. And culturally, women go out and mourn on the streets to protest. It's happened in the past, and it happened again in 2018, where women from the Northwest and women from the Southwest had what they call a lamentation campaign, where they went to the public and they cried against atrocities. Being a key member of this, that was the first platform protest from the Southern Cameroon on the ground. And this movement grew bigger and bigger, carrying out different kinds of offline and online campaigns against violence. Then I moved to the United States for a Fulbright fellowship, and I saw an advertisement for Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiation for the Conflict in Southern Cameroon. I picked interest. And incidentally, Henry was a founding member of that organization, which carried the principles that I subscribed to. And they were doing the same kind of activity, seeking for a solution to a problem that has been plaguing Cameroonians, who for us in our lifetime had not seen before. All of these different campaigns, and being a group, now Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations, of professionals who are educated, who are critical, who are non-partisan, who are seeking for peace, we sought to be that body, that critical body that could thread the pieces together and bring about dialogue and negotiation. In its engagement, and Henry will fill out on this, and seeing the repeated discourse on fragmentation, we decided that we would thread through these different organizations and bring them together to work together. And that process required first us identifying the key stakeholders as on the ground, as it was called Ground Zero, which was in Northwest and Southwest in Cameroon and in the diaspora, to bring these groups to work together towards dialogue and eventual negotiation. This therefore meant us identifying these groups, these stakeholder groups, having meetings with each stakeholder group, and then eventually bringing them together to sit together on a face-to-face basis, because it was discovered that the virtual people were not listening to each other or understanding each other. And we thought that face-to-face conversations could bring more meaning and more people having the same ideas. That is how it resulted to us bringing them to Canada, both people from Cameroon and people from the diaspora to sit together, people who are of the Southern Cameroon origin, from different communities, different constituencies, different backgrounds, women's groups, cultural groups, political groups, civil societies to sit and talk together. But prior to that, the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiation trained these different groups on policy and diplomacy and advocacy, because we were aware that these are people who had never experienced armed conflict in the past. These are people who had never experienced international diplomacy. These are people who never engaged in negotiation. So the CDN used its expertise and also recruited experts to help in these different trainings of these different groups on human rights, on women's rights, on dialogue, on diplomacy, on diplomatic writing, diplomatic engagement, and so on and so forth. So the CDM was very pivotal in threading these different constituencies of the people of Southern Cameroon, irrespective of their political leaning, but who are of that origin, because an eventual dialogue and negotiation will have to bring these different people together.
If I may add, the primary focus of the CDN from its creation is to promote, advocate for dialogue and negotiations and to end armed conflicts. So that was the primary goal that informed the creation of the CDN, and to support efforts and processes that align with this primary goal. So when some, and I'll try to limit it to the Canadian talk. So when some Ambazonian political groups and armed groups contacted us for support, we were open to help, in part because the request aligned with our goal. But we also needed to be sure that our engagement will yield the required outcome, right? Ensuring the delegation was ready to engage, ensuring that the delegation was ready to leverage the opportunity to agree on certain key aspects and the acceptance to give feedback and engage with other groups who were not involved, who were not invited on the table. So the Swiss process was allegedly initiated by some Ambazonian groups. Now, the Canada talks was initiated by the government. And to us, it indicated a semblance of seriousness by the government if the Prime Minister is requesting to meet with Ambazonian groups. For one thing, there was a consensus around Ambazonian groups that if they needed to meet with the government, they wanted to meet with the government in a neutral ground and with a reputable country as a facilitator. So that alone, gave us the latitude to accept, to support them. We had no funding and had to figure out how to contribute to help these groups. So we made individual contributions because we believed and continue to believe that justice and peace can only be achieved if both parties agree to genuinely negotiate to end the conflict. And so we did that in all good faith to help. And thank God that you, Dr. Williams, was available to provide the kind of assistance also to the Ambazonian delegation at a pro bono level because we had no funding. But the kind of contribution that we gave allowed the Ambazonian delegations, especially the principals, to travel to different countries to be able to meet and discuss on how the framework of their engagement would look like, but also to ensure that they can speak with one voice. And because we knew the dynamics among the leaders. But that is how we came to engage as CDN within the Canadian talks. We did not get any contact from Canada. no contact from Cameroon, but the fact that the Ambazonian groups who had accepted to participate reached out to request for the kind of support that we provided to them.
Henry, how did you personally come to think through how to prepare the separatist movements, the other groups in Ambazonia and Southern Cameroons to build a durable peace? What is your personal story?
Long one, of course. The first is an issue of building personal relations with the various leaders. These are groups whose members could not see eye to eye. And we had, besides funding, we had an issue with timing. And so the luck we had was that we had previous conversations with each of those leaders individually, even before Canada came into the picture. And so we used that to be able to bring them together. And the first thing was knowing that they had a lot of differences. We wanted to identify the commonalities first and deal with those commonalities, and then see how to mitigate the differences. It was difficult to bring the delegation to meet because we had limited funding, limited resources. So we had to figure out the most cost-effective way to ensure that whatever decisions are made by the principals will be trickled down to the various representatives that will be part of the delegation that we're meeting in Canada. And so that is the approach we used. We're able to make them agree on some basics, like, what do you want to see in the first meeting? What are your objectives in the first meeting? How do you make sure that you build up your narrative in the first meeting to be able to achieve your objective for that first meeting? And for instance, their first meeting was to make sure that they have a second meeting, but their first meeting was also to make sure that they highlight the failures of the Swiss process, especially to the government, and ensure that there was a CBN, a confidence building measure that builds on the experiences from the Swiss process. So all of those things were things that the first meeting tried to address. And then we had a few days now to discuss with them to prepare for the second meeting based on the outcome of the first meeting. And thankfully, you played a very critical part in advising and providing guidance.
If I can highlight what Henry is mentioning, the Ambazonian team, like we noted earlier, haven't had any experience in negotiations. And the experience of you, Dr. Williams, in conflict and negotiations, and Henry's field experience working with the UN and the processes that happen was very vital. And drawing on these two experiences under the platform of the CDN, this served as a bedrock in building framework for the Ambazonian groups. Because without these experiences and this knowledge, the government knew they were going with a very raw group that is inexperienced and they could have a walk in the park. But this training and these experiences and these frameworks that were built before the Canada talks made it possible for the Ambazonian group to come out strong and even stronger than the government of Cameroon expected, because by my analysis, they were coming in to see a fragmented, disrupted group without direction, that they will bring in whatever they want to bring in and come out and say, hey, this is what we've done. But I believe that finding a group that was well prepared, well trained, and knowledgeable in what they want, including even what they want in confidence building measures, kind of put on the government and show the government that they were confronting an opponent they did not know. And I believe that is one of the contributions to the government reneging on their engagement in that process.
Let's turn a little bit to the substantive issues writ large, and then let's dive into some of the issues that were on the table in Canada. But let's start with self-determination. When the Ambazonians, the Southern Cameroonians, are thinking about self-determination, Obviously, there's an eclectic array of views, but can you walk us through those views? Regional autonomy, refederalization, independence. Where do things stand in terms of what the movements are thinking in terms of what would build a durable peace in Cameroon?
Yeah, it is very difficult without a referendum to clearly point out the absolute position of a people faced with different alternatives. There are some who believe that federalism is the better alternative. There are a few who still believe on the special status, but based on a survey conducted by the late Cardinal Christian Toomey of blessed memory, his survey indicated that about, if not 69, 70% of over 1,000 respondents voted to support separation, and including a survey conducted, and still on Cardinal Toomey's survey, it was predominantly people on the ground and the phones of Saudi Cameroonians that took part in the survey. The CDN also conducted a survey. I think it was over 75% who also wanted independence, right? Separation. So, and that has been consistent in many of the surveys that have come after. So it is fair to say at this point that the majority prefer separation. Now, on the other hand, the government wants every discussion to be limited and aligned with the outcome of the resolutions of the major national dialogue, and seems to be very unwilling to engage in any discussion out of the framework of the resolutions of the major national dialogue, making it very difficult for any facilitation or any mediation to move forward. And it is our belief that whatever happened before the government rejected the Canada talks also aligned with this principle of the government. Whatever negotiations, be it UN, be it US, if it doesn't align with that, it will be difficult for the government to agree. If not, they may engage in the preliminary stages, but later on drop again if they feel that it doesn't align. Then also, there are also deep issues within the government that also cause those disalignment to occur, especially when it comes to talks, be it the Canada talks or the Swiss talks.
Lillian, would you like to add to that?
Yes, it is imagined by several members of government that with the human suffering that the people of Southwest and Northwest regions or Southern Cameroons have gone through in the hands of separatists, they will have a tendency to lean over to the government and no longer require separation. Without any very recent survey, I believe the results will not be any different from those of Cardinal Toomey and those of the CDN. Why do I say so? The reasons that led to the conflict have not been addressed by the government of Cameroon. For example, if I take the bilingualism committee that was created, one of the very early institutions created to resolve some of the issues that were raised, that institution has not been effective in any way in solving issues of language, which include sending information to the English-speaking region in French when they really know that these are people who speak English, issues of inclusion of members of these regions into major positions in the government, issues of the language of law, the language of the police, the language of the military, and many other things that were the root causes of the armed conflict. So I thought that quashing the people rebelling against the government or the separatists is saying that people within these regions want to stay in a united Cameroon is a wrong assumption. Another thing government did to give the autonomy, to say they have the greater autonomy of the Northwest and Southwest, as they put it, and putting it into law, there is no material or effective visibility of that autonomy of institutions because everything is still central. If we take, for example, the taxation system, the taxes still go to Yaoundé. The regions still do not have a budget that is their budget that they raise from their taxes and they manage. All decisions are still centralized. There is no autonomy in view. It's autonomy on a document which is not being implemented, or at least not visibly seen by the people as a practice of greater autonomy by the people of the Northwest and Southwest. So even though the government may have used military force where some of the violence and the strikes within the region and the resistance, it is just choice rather than a consensus with the people who still feel the pinch of what caused the problem in the first place. There'd be no resolution of any of the causes, at least not practically. It may be on paper, but not practically. So the question is the absence of the resolution of the causes of the conflict going to impact the form of the state requested by the people then and now? That's a question that, like Henry said, until there is a referendum, we cannot really determine, but from the people's action, it can be predicted. The outcome can be predicted based on how the people feel, think, say, and do, differently from what the documents present or what the government of Cameroon claims is the situation on the ground.
If Southern Cameroon, Ambazonia were to move towards independence or a heightened degree of autonomy, and if there was a solution, so to speak, what role would security sector reform of the government play? And what would DDR, demilitarization, demobilization, and reintegration play for the separatist groups? If somehow magically there was sufficient progress in the peace process, what are the parties thinking in terms of security sector reform on the part of the government and DDR on the part of the separatists? I know it's a little early to start talking about that, but just curious what the thoughts are out there on that.
Yeah, it's general knowledge that DDR instituted as part of a peace package, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that was not the case with the creation of the DDR in Cameroon immediately after the major national dialogue. President Biya announced the creation of DDR immediately. That was in November 2018 to allow separatist fighters, ex-separatist fighters and ex-Boko Haram fighters to go to the DDR. But as of today that we are having this conversation, there has not been any real impact. And because we're still having fighters going into the DDR and leaving the DDR and going to the field to fight. And the Canada, those could have been an ideal avenue for the parties to discuss security reforms had the government remained engaged, right? Ambazonian political groups and armed groups were ready to engage in these discussions. Were out of these preliminary discussions, had voiced their willingness to engage if the government had shown genuine interest. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and we do not see that happening in the nearest future. But of course, Ambazonian groups were already discussing issues around security reforms and how a practical DDR would look like should those aspects emerge in the course of their engagement during the Canada talks. But that did not happen. And hopefully, if there's an opportunity for such engagements, Ambazonian groups, I think they are well equipped to engage with the government on that.
Well, just to dive in a little more specificity, when the Ambazonian groups conceptualize DDR, are they thinking transforming the armed actors into police, into a regional army, into a military entity that is somehow integrated as a large unit into the national army, or there's many different ways and shapes that DDR, or turning in the weapons and going back home. And I don't know, Lillian, if you wanted to jump into that, or Henry, you wanted to keep the theme going.
Yeah, in principle, those thoughts were shared, right? And discussed generally. But the specifics of those discussions were not agreed by all the parties, by all the various Ambazonian delegations, leaders who were present when those discussions were being held. But it's something that they are aware of. And the most important thing was for us to ensure that there's this specific topic all of them had interest in, and such that when it came now to discussing the details, it will be easy to discuss in the details. But you have also issues where a specific topic, you had differences, right? So it was even very difficult to initiate a specific topic when there are differences. But in this case, they all accepted that's something that needs to be discussed. And so the details of that topic is something that they were all interested in having.
Lillian? Go ahead.
Yes. Generally, there are best practices for DDRs, which seek to transform armed fighters into civilians or into professions that may be related to their previous activity, but which keep them in a state of law rather than being in a radical, non-controlled way. One thing I want to highlight here, which is also a root cause of the conflict, are the different security frameworks for French-speaking countries and English-speaking countries. It is understandable that English-speaking countries basically have two major forces, the police force and the military force. And the police force is generally civilian-based, and then the military force is for wars and armed situations. But then the French systems have one which is the gendarmes. And in the context of Cameroon, the gendarmes are not a very friendly force. They are a hated force. And within the context of the Anglophone, it is a brutal force which is not civilian friendly. So a discussion of security frameworks post-conflict will start to look into how these different forces work within a civilian context and a post-conflict context, away even from the DDR. Given that the Anglophones already have their own armed forces, which are more on the military side rather than on the police side, the Anglophones will want to see a situation where the civilian police is more friendly, more Anglo-Saxon, I use that word in quotes as well, oriented, rather than the French style of policing, which is very heavily armed and does not treat the civilian in the way that the British systems treat civilians. So there is a discrepancy as to how security is viewed by the by the Southern Cameroonians, which is based on an Anglo-Saxon system, and the Republic, which is based on a French system. I believe if there were to be peace process, that should be negotiations will have to take place as to what are the security measures that will be put in place where the people will feel comfortable.
Well, Lillian, let's pick up on that for the next topic that I want to talk about, which is justice and accountability. As you mentioned, under the current security framework, the gendarmerie responsible for policing is quite heavy-handed. Human rights abuses have occurred. Arguably, atrocity crimes have occurred. What are the Ambazonians thinking about in terms of, if peace process progresses, what might be the most appropriate mechanisms for justice and accountability? Some referral to the International Criminal Court, a hybrid atrocity crime tribunal, or using the domestic process with the specialized chamber, or going the South African route of an amnesty-based truth commission. What are the Ambazonians, Southern Cameroonians thinking about in terms of the context of justice and accountability?
When it came to discussions within the Canada talks, we didn't get to that stage, but the Ambazonian delegation had some thoughts about it. First, it would depend on the peace package, what is offered, what is agreed on. If there is a transitional period, that would definitely lead to a referendum. Of course, the South African Truth and Reconciliation mechanism was something that they were considering. It's not only looking at both parties, right? on how they could sit and really talk about reconciliation. Now, but if the negotiations had resulted to a direct independence for Southern Cameroons, they would have also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but that would have taken another haul, right? It wouldn't have been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it brings together the entire Cameroon, but this now will be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brings together Southern Cameroonians who were in support of something else, maybe supporting the government, in keeping the special status, supporting the government, advocating for non-violence, non-use of arms. So all of those things were being discussed. But of course, what came out of it was that the outcome of the negotiations would definitely indicate what kind of system is preferred. Of course, there were some who thought that the international system was also good. So, but there was no consensus on that. But that topic was already being discussed within the Ambazonian delegation.
One thing I must say following social cognition is that, like Henry said, the outcome of the negotiations will really greatly determine if it were separation. It will be a different kind of peace and reconciliation, but assuming that it was something like a federation or autonomy or anything, meaning that the republic stays together, irrespective of whether it's a federation, confederation, or autonomy, therein a generation of trust. And it's going to take a lot for the government of Cameroon to build trust with the English-speaking Cameroonians, with the people of the Southern Cameroons. Because through the history of these two entities, there is systematic betrayal, continued lies, absence of keeping to word any promises that were ever made. And that absence of trust goes on and on till today. And any form of truth and reconciliation between these two entities without an oversight of a trusted body is going to collapse. The reason why there's always the need for a third party, which is external to these two, in any such endeavor, whether it is the judicial system or the security system, there is an absence of trust because the Republic of Cameroon has a history of betrayal to the people of the Southern Cameroons.
Let me pick up on that theme of a third party, both in the context of justice and accountability, also in the context we were just talking about earlier, security sector reform, DDR, and in terms of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction. To whom do the Ambazonians and the Southern Cameroonians look to as neutral third parties, presumably the Swiss and the Canadians, but how is their view of the United Nations, which is oftentimes involved in humanitarian assistance, and the Cameroonians? To whom do they look to, if anybody, for third-party assistance? If there is a peace process, what might this collage of third-party involvement actually look like?
Well, the Southern Cameroonians have often called on the United Nations as a third party because the United Nations was even at the root cause of the problem, in that at the time of independence, instead of giving independence to the Southern Cameroon as it was done with other countries, they rather gave them an option to stay with Nigeria or stay with the Republic of Cameroon. Often, the Southern Cameroonians have called on the United Nations to fix the problem they created. And Henry has a better understanding of the UN systems, but the UN systems have been silent. Even if they've been doing things in the background, they have not been overt in their engagement in this particular armed conflict. And it is still the wish of the people of Southern Cameroon to have the United Nations be a third party in resolving this conflict, as also there is absence of trust on the African Union. There's absence of trust on the French and the British because they feel that these people have failed them. Generally, they trust countries that are members of the UN Security Council, but which are not colonial countries to Cameroon. like the United States, like Canada. But now there is a feeling of abandonment by the people of Southern Cameroon because their case is not on anyone's table, at least not now. And systematic calls to the United Nations have not yielded desired interventions, which are the countries they really want to see involved in mediating this conflict. But then Henry even work with.
No, I think the Ambazonian groups are open when it comes to third parties. Then, even though they have mentioned the UN system, they also understand that the UN system has a lot of bottlenecks as well. And so that's why when the Swiss came up, they were open to engage in that process. And that's why when Canada came up, they were also open to engage in the process. But I think from lessons learned, they would, as I've been told, they will prefer a multi-country facility process just to ensure that there's more pressure on the parties to be able to engage, able to implement the agreements that they will eventually reach. So to the best of my knowledge, having discussed, especially within that process, with the various leaders, and after the process collapsed, the lessons learned that they will prefer a multi-country mediation effort, such that guarantors ensure that, especially the government of Cameroon, based on history, commits to the process and is able to implement the agreements that are reached during such negotiations.
Thank you for listening to episode 1 of our 2-part interview with Dr. Lillian Atanga and Henry Atam Oben. Join us as we continue this fascinating conversation in episode 2, where we discuss the recent Canadian-led peace talks, exploring what worked, what didn't, and what it'll take to secure lasting peace in Cameroon. We'll see you there.
The assimilation process meant encroaching, eroding the English cultures and implanting the French culture. And I think 2016 was a peak of this encroachment where they then said, no, this is too much. We need to resist, otherwise we will be completely assimilated.
The 2016 strike just adds to a series of strikes against the erosion of the Southern Cameroon's identity. And the evolution of social media really exposed the brutality of government forces against the striking teachers and lawyers. And that is where the issue really exacerbated and it turned to a full-fledged conflict.
It started with machetes, not even guns, before it grew to where we are today. So I'm looking at this crucial moment where government failed to negotiate, and government has repeatedly failed to negotiate with several opportunities that has been given to the government, not listening to the voice of the people.
Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. In each episode, we engage with diplomats, lawyers, and peace builders who have played pivotal roles in efforts to resolve conflicts around the world. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am joined by 2 remarkable guests, Dr. Lillian Atanga and Henry Atam Oben, both of whom have played pivotal roles in efforts to drive forward peace between Ambazonia and Cameroon. Dr. Lillian Atanga is an influential voice in the intersection of gender, discourse, and politics, serving previously as an associate professor in the of Bumenda and currently a senior researcher at the University of the Free State Bloemfontein Fontaine, South Africa. Lillian was also a key figure in the Southwest, Northwest Women's Task Force, a powerful coalition of women-led civil society organizations dedicated to championing peace and rebuilding social harmony in southern Cameroon. Beyond her academic experience, Dr. Atanga was the executive director of I Am Cameroon, an inspiring NGO that empowers young people to be agents of change and leadership in their communities. Henry Atam is a political and electoral affairs consultant with the United Nations and the executive director of the United States Center for Electoral Support, bringing over a decade of experience in election administration and conflict prevention to help parties effectively conduct free and fair elections. Henry's extensive experience includes managing election assistance programs in developing democracies and participation in more than 15 electoral observation missions, making him a seasoned advocate for the democratic process. In late 2022, my colleague Ryan Westlake and I had the privilege of working alongside Henry, Lillian, and the team at the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations to help the Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia delegation prepare for peace negotiations with the government of Cameroon after years of conflict. Today, we'll reflect on that process and the lessons learned. Lillian, Henry, thank you both for joining me. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, let's go ahead. And before we dive into the specifics of the peace talks, could you provide us some background on the Southern Cameroon conflict? What are the key underlying causes that have fueled this conflict over the decades?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Before I jump into the question, many have called the conflict an Anglophone conflict, right? But when you use the word Anglophone, one is tempted to think that it's a conflict or crisis emanating from. And so in reality, it's deeper and more profound than that. So I would use the term Southern Cameroons, Ambazonia. In some cases, I can go on with Anglophone, but just to make sure that your listeners understand that one can use Southern Cameroon's conflict, Ambazonian conflict, and others can also as well use Anglophone conflict to describe the nature of the conflict. The underlying cause of the conflict is the attempt to assimilation of the people of the Southern Cameroons. I will use the words of the President Biya himself while he was in Paris, into an identity different from theirs. You can talk about the systems, you can talk about the processes and the way of life, from education to judiciary to governance to freedoms and rights. So those are all attempts at peaceful dialogue with the government of Cameroon were made by reputable Southern Cameroonians without any response of the government. So carrying arms was seen by some as the best alternatives after the brutal response by the government forces during a peaceful protest led by teachers and lawyers in 2016. Lillian may add a little bit of flesh into that.
Well, at a deeper level and at a more visible level to the ordinary people, these discriminations manifested themselves in educational systems where the English-speaking Cameroonians, who are Southern Cameroonians, differently from Anglophone Cameroonians, found that their system of education, which is British-based, following the colonial rule, is completely different from the Francophone system of education, which is French-based. And the imposition of the French educational system, not just in terms of curriculum, but the language in use in educational systems was a problem. And a lot more French-speaking Cameroonians were teaching in the English-speaking Cameroons in language which was approximative English and sometimes French to children who were supposed to be speaking English and learning in English. That became a big problem. And from a personal perspective, I moderated pre-2016 on a lot of teachers' meetings complaining that their children are being taught by French-speaking or Francophones in a language that wasn't English. At a legal perspective, that was also very visible in the different legal systems where the Anglophones were using the common law and the Francophones were using, I don't know what law that is. But then the encroachment of the different legal systems was a problem. But then this did not happen only recently in 2016. These problems were problems that had been planted at the beginning of the Republic, a republic which was initially the British Southern Cameroons with a system that was brought in from when they were still in Nigeria and being administered by Britain into the French Cameroons to a French system that was an adoption of the French, as in France, system of education and legal system. And these two parallel systems had coexisted, sometimes each independent from the other. But as Henry said, the assimilation process meant encroaching, eroding the English cultures of the English system and implanting the French culture. And I think 2016 was a peak of this encroachment where they then said, no, this is too much. We need to resist, otherwise we will be completely assimilated. One thing that we have to note is that these Anglophones kept noticing the gradual encroachment into that system, and they kept complaining. And there was a communique by the teacher syndicate of the University of Boya that if nothing is done, this will escalate into violence or a war that the government may not be able to deal with. And true to it, 2 years down the line from that note from the teachers of the University of Boya to the Minister of Higher Education, it happened just like that. But this is not something that just happened in 2016. It's something that had been brewing for over 40 years to 2016. So we had the remote courses, which date back to colonial time, and the immediate courses, which was a resistance by the government to listen to the voice of the people.
Now, Lillian and Henry, picking up on that, with the 2016 strike by the teachers and the lawyers, because of these issues, the encroachment by the Francophone into the Anglophone system, the response, as you know, wasn't to listen to the concerns and the demands, but basically to meet these protests with a very heavy-handed government response, government action. Can you walk us through that time period of 2016 and how that government response galvanized the formation of separatist movements advocating for a heightened degree of internal self-determination or external self-determination in the form of an independent Ambazonia or Southern Cameroons?
Let me say this: separatist propaganda, right, and groups like the Southern Cameroon Youth League already existed before 2016, but were not armed to engage in fighting. So you have leaders like Ebenezer Akwanga, who was the leader of the Southern Cameroon Youth Movement, was arrested and jailed on grounds of inciting secession way years before 2016. He escaped from jail. He succeeded in escaping from jail and got through Nigeria to the US and advocated for the use of arms as a means to compel the government to engage in negotiations. I mean, and that was way far before 2016. So the foundation of an armed struggle was already in place. But let me take you through some historical facts that informed the outbursts in 2016. In 1960, the Republic of Cameroon gained independence and was admitted into the United Nations. 1961, Southern Cameroon was voted to gain independence by joining the Republic of Cameroon. I'm using the word Republic of Cameroon, and you will definitely see where it reappears again. And when that happened, that was on condition that the federal system would ensure self-governance and preserve the identity of the people of the Southern Cameroons. In 1972, the two-state federal system, West, that represented the Anglophone Cameroons, and East Cameroon, that represented the French-speaking part of Cameroon, was abolished through a referendum. In what many say,
In the heart of Ambazonia, where the sunrises hide, the spirit of freedom dances across the sky. From the days of '61, when independence was won, your shadows loomed as battles were begun. Through the valleys and hills, where courage never fades, the echoes of leaders, their legacy cascades. John and Rufuncha's dreams, Henley's steadfast fight, Bolandra's wisdom shining like a guiding light. Oh, Ambazonia, your time has come.